Hello, welcome all. Great to have you all here. My name is Abhishek Nilamber, and I'm here with my colleague Laura Kloeckner. We greet you on behalf of Savvy Contemporary, an art space and a discursive platform, space for food, music, conviviality based in Berlin. Savvy Contemporary positions itself at the threshold of constructs of the West and the non-West, to primarily deconstruct, critique, and unlearn these notions and forge epistemic diversity and decanonization through art. Well, a bit of history about the project that we are about to begin. The project United Screens started at Savvy Contemporary in 2018 and is a long-term research, exhibition, and networking project that sets out to create horizontal alliance of community cinema programmers, loving independent films, sharing a condition of economic or political vulnerability, and therefore being easily subjected to unfair trade-offs within the cinema industry, the globalized cinema industry. Over the course of the next 2 years, we are launching the second chapter of the project, running by the title Near East, Middle East, Far East, Contemplations on Contemporary Cinema, by which the near, middle, and far are strike through. As the title indicates, we want to challenge the Orientalist gaze that still manifests itself in the domain of cinema distribution and still in the ways in which a multiplicity of visual cultures are represented, written about, framed, administered, and archived. Together with our partners Vekalet Behna in Egypt, AVEC in Tunisia, the Network of Arab Alternative Screens in Lebanon, and Estacio Terrena in Colombia, Archipel in Indonesia, and many more, we will work together to imagine a new cinematic infrastructure or cinema infrastructure for the circulation of film and video art. We want to create a model for a decentrally curated platform powered by digital and internet technology, but accessible from everywhere and accommodated to any geography possible. There are films being seen in many parts of the world and not just only in cinema screens. So when we're thinking about the system or this cinema infrastructure for distribution, we're also accommodating all possible spaces.
Of course, it would be much more fun if we could meet physically, but because we find ourselves confined to the digital space for now, we want and the medium to incubate more on this idea of technology and digitality. How can and should we appropriate technology to work for communities rather than corporations? How do we understand technology, and how can we learn from different contexts and practices of resistance, subversions, appropriations, cooperations, financing, and accomplishments to integrate these learnings into working towards this decentralized cinema circulation ecosystem? And how do the notions of collectivity, space, and technology interrelate? These and many more questions that we've been dealing with over the past couple of months gave birth to the United Screens Rushes series, which is a series of virtual conversations. So our plan is over the course of the next 7 months to have each of our partner spaces host one online session to bring together filmmakers and technologists to think and contemplate and raise questions and to trigger excitement. The rushes we perceive them as sketches alluding to daily rushes in the film production. They can be unfinished conversation, brainstorms, which we will build on to understand what tools we need to consider and what interests we need to accommodate when we think of a technology that enables us to think of a decentralized film ecosystem.
And we are extremely happy to start the first series of rushes with you today. We like to think of rushes, yes, as sketches, but also as jam sessions, inviting experts who master their instruments and come together to explore and create, not with the intention to bring forth a perfectly orchestrated tune. We want to raise questions together. Unfortunately, though one of the participants, our own Dr. Bonaventure Nidikung, would not be able to join us today um, as he's not feeling well. We send him our very best regards and hope we can find him in a conversation in spirit and in person for one of the upcoming sessions. We would have loved to have his input too on the questions and mediation of space. Nonetheless, we have an incredible panel of souls here today, and it's great to see you all on screen. Hello. I would like to welcome first Jihan El-Tahri, who's an award-winning film director, writer, visual artist, producer, and a friend. She currently serves as the general director of Berlin-based documentary support institution DocsBox. Jihan has been a member of the Academy Oscars since 2017. She has directed more than 15 films, and her visual art exhibitions have traveled to renowned museums and several biennials around the world. She continues to mentor in various documentary and filmmaking labs. Jihan has served on the boards of several African film organizations, including the Federation of Pan-African Cinema and the Guild of African Filmmakers in the Diaspora. Hello, we welcome you, Jihan.
And we also welcome Tunde Giwa. Hello, Tunde. Thank you for being with us. Tunde is passionate about technology and higher education, content creation and distribution. He believes in simple technologies and processes expertly integrated that can solve everyday problems, promote efficiency, and enhance one's overall quality of life. He founded the institution or the for-profit social enterprise Orchestrated Solutions, and he has been working as the Chief Technology Officer at the Juilliard School in New York City. So we thank you very much for joining from the early hours of New York. Hi, Tunde.
Hello, everyone.
And we have with us also Juan, Pablo García Sossa. He's a designer, researcher, and an artist fascinated by the clash between emerging technologies and popular culture in tropical regions. This is of interest because I am in one of them right now, Kochi in Kerala. Shout out from here. Juan's practice explores how emerging technologies are remixed and reappropriated in tropical areas and develop alternate understandings and systems. He researches and develops future and alternative realities with real and semi-fictional organizations in a wide range of media such as graphics, interfaces, web installations, and other visual experiments. He explores ways of sensibilization through narrative experiences of interaction and envision tropical futures. I hope your tropical future also extends to cold Berlin and I can get some papayas there. He's also part of Savvy Contemporary and the curatorial team of United Screens, and also co-directing the space Estación Terrena in Colombia. Welcome, Juan.
Hi, everybody. Thanks for the introduction.
Wow, so it's great to have you all here joining us from various parts of the world. And we already said that our backgrounds give quite a nice picture here and that Jihan definitely wins in her Italian domicile. Once again, thank you for joining us. We'd like to start with the conversation with a quote by Jean-Pierre Bécolo from his text, Welcome to Applied Fiction. I will read the following quote. He writes, "To sum up, our role on this planet is entirely political. Our role with or without technology is to make social structures, relationships between people and between groups. This will enable us to survive as a species in our cosmic vessel, immortality. We shouldn't just be making movies, we should be changing reality." Dear Jihan, film is about expression, engagement, and transmitting stories or imaginaries. Networks of solidarity have been a recurring topic both in your films most prominently maybe in Cuba and African Odyssey, but also in your artistic practice. You are a member of the, as we heard before, a member of the FEPACI, the Federation of Pan-African Cinema, and a number of other guilds. And since last year, you're the director of an organization called Docsbox in Berlin, which seeks to empower and support filmmakers from the Arab African region. When we look at the current cinema ecosystem, why have South-South alliances been so important to you? And how did it help you to tell your stories? And maybe also, where have you faced difficulties?
I think for me, the recognition that South-South narratives have not really had a space was, let's say, over the past 10 years. And yeah, 10, 15 years. And it's been really important to recognize that alternative stories are enriching, and that there is a way and there is a means to actually redefine our understanding of ourselves and of our world when you have more different alternatives. So like if we watch Hollywood films the whole time, what will we end up with? And I think that the actual way of telling a story is very different wherever you go. Now, the screen space has kind of limited us to a certain format. And this is something that I've been very keen on trying to explore, because it's just like, for example, the linearity of telling a story in the Western way of telling a story is completely different than the way me coming from Egypt would normally tell a story. So we've kind of adopted these methodologies because, or ways of telling stories, because that's the only space and the only way to get screen time. And I think that the idea of South-South solidarity comes from the idea that, I guess, the concept of internationalism, in the 60s started with the idea of the solidarity of the weak. And the solidarity of the weak means that together we're powerful and together we'll be listened to. And for me, just telling stories from a different perspective became more possible or probable if there was this kind of South-South collective idea that, yeah, that we have our own audiences. I don't need to make a film in this format just to exist.
You wrote, or you said in an interview before, that sort of the problem is that still in African cinema, sort of the idea is that the pie isn't big enough for everyone, but that maybe in sort of trying to forge these alliances, that maybe this pie or the piece of the pie could get bigger.
I personally believe that the pie is huge, but we are led to believe that the pie isn't big enough. The system, the way the system works, and I'm talking about mainly the cinema system, is that there's only really space for one or two African names because we can't pronounce them. So by the time you kind of get to learn how to say that name, I'm exaggerating, but it's actually true. You'll for 4 years you'll only hear the name of this one African filmmaker, as though there are no others that exist. And what that entails is that all the funding, all the panels, all the invitations, everything will be diverted towards that one filmmaker. And it kind of, the way the system works, it like takes this young filmmaker and rises him up to the very top. And then all of a sudden he disappears. And then like 5 years later, it's like, well, whatever happened to that person? So it's a very problematic system, because like, I'll give you a very good example. Someone like Newton Adwaka, who's a Nigerian filmmaker who started, he did one of my favorite ever films called Rage, and then he did another film that won the Golden Etalon at FESPACO, and he was kind of coached to be the next Abdurrahman Sisseko, but he didn't want to play that game. He didn't want to be part of that system. He wanted to tell the next story the way he wanted to tell it. He was suddenly cut off of every single form of financing, and it took him a good 10 years to make his next short film, which he had to finance himself because he wasn't playing the game. And I think I'm not pointing fingers at anyone. I'm not saying that all this is done with some kind of visceral meanness or anything, but it's just how it works. And to contest that system is very complicated. And I think one of the ways to do that is by creating alternative collectives and alternative voices that then, in and of themselves, they have the power and the audience for the others to sit up and listen. Because, I mean, ultimately, let's be honest, we can do whatever we want to do, but coming from the countries we come from, we need the financing of the North. We can't do without it. We can't make films without it. The real question is, it's a win-win, and we both need to recognize that it's a win-win, and for the North to recognize that they need our voice as much as we need their money, and not one thing is better than the other, and start talking to each other on eye level. And I think that's the real battle. I don't want to be patronized just because I'm getting the money. They're getting my story, which is well worth their money, I think.
Totally. I mean, I think it is definitely a myth that the pie is, there's only so much pie. And maybe we're just seeing maybe a slice of it, but maybe we should start looking around us and see where all these little slices line up and make this whole big pie, and not just these little slices. And I think that's exactly why South talking and saying, hey, I see your pie and we can put our pies together should start happening. And I mean, in this regard, I would also think about, I mean, not just the production pie, let's say, but also the exhibition. Like, how do we get to the audience and can also cross and share audiences? And I think at some point, digital somehow proposed to be that space. And who better to talk about that than with Tunde? You know, you were already exploring ideas for alternative film circulation methods for years. You had ideas around VOD platforms before people even knew they should care about something like this, you know, and that also probably meant, that also probably meant that the world wasn't ready for it, I guess. And we are interested to know where are you with your research and practice, and what fascinates you about this digital space or technology?
Well, thanks for that question. I'm actually old enough to remember a time before the internet. I remember it well, and I prefer it now than it was before. I've been fascinated by internet technology from the very beginning, and I think I quickly saw its future, that it was going to be a transformative technology. And I also had a very strong interest in film. I still do, very, very much. And it made sense that, you know, if everybody at home eventually has a high-speed internet connection, that it would be possible to send content through that means to their homes. And I've been looking at that for a really long time. I've also been working in education, and as everyone knows, the whole planet is at a major inflection point today as all of learning has shifted online, and it's helped to concentrate people's minds about this. The interesting thing is that both movies and educational content, the best ones, are actually very, very similar. The best online educational content is not a teacher jumping on a Zoom call. It's actually a carefully produced course with video, audio, graphics. It involves a large team of experts to produce it. And it's actually produced in studios very similar to films. And the challenges of production and the challenges of distribution kind of parallel each other and the same issues are seen. I do think it all comes down to a question of in imagining a future, a connected future. It all comes down to a question of business models and what way to accomplish out of that platform. But in very, very general, I'm a big believer that technology applied properly can solve a lot of our problems. And we'll get into a lot more detail as we go along.
Definitely, we will definitely pick up on that. Maybe this is also a cue for you, Juan. You're a visual artist and a researcher. You're based between Colombia and Berlin, and you have a very interesting project called Tropical Virus. I think it's really interesting when we think about how the virus actually as a type of technology can infiltrate and change ecosystems. And maybe in line with what Tunde just said about how we can imagine a collective future and how we can sort of think technology as a connecting device. Maybe you want to tell us more about the virus.
Yes, absolutely. I think I'll tell you a little bit more about the virus. I would like to share my screen and show you some stuff. Maybe you can give me a quick feedback if you see my screen now. Just say yes or no. Someone?
Yeah.
Okay, thanks. Then I go. So I come originally from Colombia, grew up in Bogota, and I began my practice just by asking myself, what role did I play as a Colombian designer, not in Colombia anymore, and being in Berlin as a non-German. And here I began with my investigation that I called a tropical virus. And the tropical virus is an investigation on ways and technology is being misused or reappropriated in tropical regions. I'm fascinated with the idea of the tropics. I feel more related to Kenya or Vietnam than US America or Europe, as we share similar climates and food. And besides that, the idea of the Greek roots of tropics are tropikos, and it means to turn. I'm super fascinated on how these realities in the tropical regions are constantly challenging what is possible and what is not, and how people in popular culture find a way to turn things around. And this has brought different ways of distributing digital content in the form of USB sticks, for example, in Colombia. with piracy that you don't get anymore in CD-ROMs, they were way ahead and exploring different formats and distributing not only music but also films and ebooks, podcasts, and basically anything. And all this in the form of expressed in popular culture. And similar to this, you could see different forms of distribution, like in curated in Nairobi, different cinema rooms, screen rooms, or also the USB-based distribution networks in Cuba called El Paquete Semanal. Paquete Semanal is sort of parallel offline internet, as it's too expensive to have access of internet in Cuba. 1 hour of internet cost roughly $25. People started downloading torrents of content, films, ebooks, podcasts, screenshots of websites, and save it to hard drives that they would sell for only $1. And every week, the weekly package or Paquete Semanal is updated with new content and also delivered to places in the countryside that otherwise will have like problems with connections. I feel more with technology not only as a problem solver, but more a troublemaker, and definitely a field that hasn't been yet sufficiently influenced by flavors of the tropics or the global south. This is a street in Bamako, in Mali, where people gather and distribute and exchange directly music as if it were an analog version of a Spotify. The interesting thing here is that these people approach to you with a song, they see how you like it, and they start suggesting other songs that you might potentially like. And this is kinda stronger than any other algorithm there is. There's like a human touch in this. I developed the tropical virus as a set of tactics compared with the qualities of a virus in ways drawing a parallel on these infection systems that develop scenarios that otherwise would be unthought in the global north, and some of these qualities or tactics involve the parasiting infrastructures, so developing systems around you, or using technology as a vector. For example, USB sticks as mosquitoes spreading the virus. It's also influenced the aesthetics and paradigms you see in popular culture. These are homemade closets or modified closets or wardrobes turned into sound systems in the Caribbean and Colombian Caribbean called picos. And picos are painted, depicting different narratives. Every pico has a name. For example, this is called Franco Turbo, El Maxi, Video Machena. And you see how these imaginaries are starting to develop around ways of different forms of technologies that maybe in the north are not so present. Similar to this are, of course, the matatus in Nairobi in Kenya, buses that also take the name of a film or a football club or a singer, and are also painted and modified, tweaked with LEDs, neon lights, and slogans. So this is basically my take on this investigation. I can't stop sharing screens before it gets funky. with the feedback, or maybe it's also intended. Like, who knows? There are other forms of technologies, and I strongly believe in a dialogue between the North and South and South, and the different exchange of diverse forms of knowledge, technology, and design that hasn't been sufficiently influenced yet. And hopefully, by providing more of this input, we will be able to redistribute both the networks of technologies and imaginaries that are currently now, and hopefully aim for more horizontality and less verticality in the way we relate to each other. Also, like relating to what Jihan mentioned before with the financial and narrative exchange, there is North-South. I'm excited to see how more lateral exchange could take place within the tropical belt or the global South. So thanks for
Juan,
this.
I had a couple of questions, very fascinating. I'm really fascinated by that low tech thing. The first question, the USB sticks. That's a
Yes.
excuse me. That's really very fascinating. But I'm wondering, is that formal? It's likely to be informal, but are they? Do the creators of the works get any money back? Because it looks like the CD market, which is how Nollywood films used to be distributed, the same sort of garish flyers and posters, but the the art owners, the work owners never made any money. The content had moved on, and it was totally in the realm of piracy. I was wondering
Yeah.
if it's anything like that.
No, of course, this is like strongly influenced in piracy systems that don't pay royalties to the creators or authors. They are also not paying to big corporations, to like Netflix, Google, YouTube, and so on. It's another thing, but of course there's always this question of how you as a cultural producer or content creator could find a way of living basically and financing yourself and your projects if like content is getting distributed, but you can live out of only applauses.
Yes.
Actually,
And then my second,
sorry, go ahead, Tunde.
I just had a quick second question. You mentioned these painted speakers. You described them as pecos. Is that correct? They sound like Jamaican sound systems,
Yes.
and it seems like they serve a similar function. Very
Yes, they are like
interesting. I wonder if they operate the same way. Like they're a big cultural force. They move from town to town, playing music, and
yeah.
the artists are part of that collective, and it's a whole sort of a moving band of performers. But great stuff.
Yes.
Thanks.
Do you want me to comment on this, or I did?
Sure.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah, this is not a specifically film, but it's more music, but also relates with the narrative imaginaries they depict in the names they take. It has some influence with the Jamaican sound systems. They are in the Colombian Caribbean coast. They play rare vinyls from Africa very often. So that's the direct lateral exchange there is between Ghana and other countries in Africa with Colombia. They scratch
Is
the
that
vinyls.
pancetta? I heard of a style called pancetta. a form of Colombian music. But I interrupted you. I'm sorry. Go ahead.
Palenque, yeah, the drums, or with cumbia related. Like cumbia takes also the roots from the African drum and percussion rhythms. And so here is interesting when like this lateral exchange is happening with no northern intermediator. I mean, it happened also because of a colonial legacy, of course. But the interesting thing is with the because it comes from the English word pick up, from the turntables. And the interesting thing with them is that basically a family could live out of owning a pico. So where they will throw parties in the street, there are artists that are only painting picos. There are people that are only carrying the speakers. It develops a known ecosystem around them. And this is where I find like interesting points happening around the building up of imaginaries, both visually and sonoric, that in other regions of Colombia doesn't take place. Actually, also mostly in the northern Colombian coast. Yes, Jihan, please.
Yeah, I'm going to jump in because what I find really interesting how first Tunde and then you started with technology. And one of the things that I find really important is how to integrate technology in our lives and in our movies rather than allow technology to take over our lives. And while you were talking about the low tech, and all of these different systems where technology comes in, yet at the same time, the essential ingredient was the human factor.
Yes.
Like even the visuals, even although a lot of the visuals that you showed us is very northern imported and transformed, a very advertisement kind of visual transmission, but at the same time there's this space where the human adapts the technology and adapts the northern visual to its needs. And I think this is where I find the problematic right now. And what it is at least conversations like this and initiatives like this need to be thinking about, because we've had, it's not just the internet, technology in general. I mean, I come from the days where I did my first documentary on 35 millimeters. We'd go shooting. We were 11 people on location, and my last shoot, I was alone with my camera and my sound and everything contained. You could think it's good, but it's not just good. It's how do you find this equilibrium between what it is we're actually doing and what is the mode of transmitting that and distributing that. And I think that amongst the positive as well as dangerous moments and elements that we're facing right now is that it's so easy, it's so simple. Let's just go, let's just show this on the internet and it's going to work brilliantly and all of this. And I kind of want to take us back to what we mean by the word culture. I mean, Tunde immediately asked the question of who gets what out of it. And I think envisaging a future where people like ourselves can still make a living because that's what we do, culture, and yet transmit it to a wider thing, and you know, I personally, I'm not at all against piracy. On the contrary, my films wouldn't be seen if no one pirated them, because the mainstream excludes us. Okay, if we're generous after a year, we're excluded from the mainstream. Okay, that's being generous. And then
that
you
depends
live
on
this
who you
whole,
are
yes,
and who's,
but
yeah.
you live on a whole ecosystem of piracy that might not actually give you the money directly, but what it generates is a different form. So I guess what I'm trying to say is, let's redefine culture, and let's redefine what culture needs. And, you know, there used to be a time in the 60s and the 70s where part of each country's budget was attributed to culture. Let's redefine who gives what to whom. And, you know, I think, and from what the virus is about, you know, tropical virus, why don't we include these problematics rather than just stick to the format that we've been given, saying, if you're going to do this, then you have to copyright it. Then that's the old system. If you want to change that system, we got to challenge even that. You know, why not?
Jihan, what you said there was very profound, and it's actually, if I wanted to summarize everything I wanted to say today, it's contained in the sentence you had there. And here's what I believe: that technology should serve us, and we shouldn't be serving technology. And if we can keep that in mind, I think that is at the core of everything I'm trying to say. So I do agree with you. But the issue is there, if someone is making content, I mean, we don't have an argument about piracy, which uh, I understand why you have that position. But if I'm investing my money to make content, I would like to recoup some of it somehow. I don't know exactly how we're going to do it, but everything should be on the table. And I agree, at this moment of reimagining, all the means should be considered. And but
Can I
these are
can I
good.
jump
And
in for can I jump in for a second? That's just
sure,
an old example, okay? When the
okay,
Moroccan cinema space wanted to re-enter the game of being a big player, one of the issues, obviously, like how do we recoup money? How do we find the funding and the financing to actually make a difference and become a player? One of the ideas they came up with is that we'll take a very, very low percentage on every ad that comes on TV and invest that money in cinema. So, I mean, there was this joke at the time, is that yogurt is paying for our cinemas. And if we go back to the end of the Second World War, that's how French cinema started. The CNC is entirely financed by a percentage of tax on ticket sales of all American films that are showed in France, and can only be invested in French cultural films. So the reason I'm saying that is these were things that were thought of at the time to overcome this obstacle of how do we recoup the money? How do we? So I guess what we need to do is come up with something that allows our stories, our visuals, our different way of telling things to circulate in a way that might not fit perfectly into copyrights, might not fit perfectly. Imagine something else. It's up to us to do that. For God's sake, I mean, people invented the internet. We're talking to each other through 5 continents. Surely we can think of something. Okay, maybe I haven't come up with it. Somebody else must. But go ahead. Yeah.
Go ahead, Juan.
Yes.
Juan, I think.
Thank you. Yeah, that's a very good point and very interesting point. Of course, the piracy aspect and the position of the content creator is something that must be considered at the very top. These sprouts of tropical virus that I showed are grassroots reappropriations of technologies. They are not coming from the top down, they're bottom up, no? The interesting thing is to find a dialogue and a symbiotic relationship between the bottom up and the top down to solve or explore these issues. In many tropical territories, as Colombia, this kind of financing, or as you mentioned, is not a given. It's something that doesn't exist. It's elsewhere, and it's most of the time in the north. Maybe the most important, the thing I would like to highlight with this misuse or reappropriation of technology is that we don't need to read the instruction manuals. We can rescript them ourselves. But this must be an active performance in the way we relate with emerging technologies. If we don't have control over them, the control will be over us. And it's worth finding out ways to turn it around. And in my proposition will be from the Tropicos, or from a Tropicos perspective.
Yeah, it's an interesting proposition, this, and I would like to connect, I would request you to connect it to this seeing the whole pie and South-South dialogue. Maybe this grassroots appropriation has something to teach us in how we can also make a connection between these grassroots appropriations. Because the thing is, this is my perception coming from a country like India, where there are so many languages, so many like different religions, and also different, of course, cultural expressions, and it changes every 200 kilometers, for example. And it's not that there is a dearth of interest of people who want to see something different. There's not a dearth of people who want to show something different. The trouble is that there's no support from either a private entity, like some fund or whatever, a grant system or a government grant system. And I think it is by design, that it's totally by design that there is no dialogue between people who are, rendered voiceless. So I'm wondering, if any one of you could answer that. I'm wondering, where do you see the role of technology if there is this bridging this gap, if there is one, if you see one?
Go ahead.
I'll just say one thing before I'll leave the technology people to talk about the technology. I think one of the really interesting formats to look at is Iranian cinema. Okay, Iranian cinema has made its way through all these obstacles despite political, economic, and the rest of it. We got to ask ourselves why. Okay, same with Korean cinema. And one of the things that I just want to underline is that part of the reason African cinema doesn't work that well is because our African audiences do not want to see our films. Let's be honest, okay? They discover Jibril Diop Mombeti when he starts coming through the Western circuit. Yeah, through the Western circuit, and then say, oh, wow, that's a fantastic film. So there is some problematic that I think is, I'm not going to get too political, although it's difficult not to. There is a problematic of who do we represent and what kind of visual can we call authentic? Okay? Because the truth is, let's be honest, every Nigerian today wants to watch Nollywood. Nobody wants to watch like the independent, really interesting stuff that we think needs to exist. And before getting into the technology, I kind of want to recenter this, because talking about film in general is talking about too much. Okay, there's too much out there, and there's every kid in the hood has his YouTube channel. There's experimental film, there's art films, there's Nollywood, there's Bollywood, there's Gollywood, and I can go on with the woods. But the truth is that culturally speaking, let's not forget what cinema was or cinema is, and what film and the kind of film, at least that I'm here to defend, is about. It's about an independent visual language that is trying to transmit a state of being that is more universal than we think it is. It's something that I can say as an Egyptian, that you as an Indian, Laura as a German, Tunde, and like all of us sitting here, it will resonate with us, because the point you're trying to make doesn't really matter where you filmed it, doesn't really matter what story it is. And that's why films, I mean, Jibril comes to mind, because that's what I thought when I was there. But a film like Tukibuki or a film like Hyenas is ultimately about the problem of modernity and how do we deal with it. It could be, it resonates in Colombia, it resonates everywhere. Because what does it mean for us as individuals living in this world, and how are we negotiating our future? So I think it's the space available for that kind of film that is shrinking dramatically. And if we're part of this conversation, it's how can technology provide that space to allow us to continue, to allow filmmakers like myself and others to continue making these films without just relying on copyright, because copyright doesn't want our films. It's not going to distribute our films. There has to be a mechanism that allows the existence of these narratives that engage all of us, that are important for all of us, even if we don't realize it or recognize it immediately. These films survive. I mean, Tukibuki or Hyenas, or I mean, like Cuba's African Odyssey, one of my films, it's still circulating 16 years later. Why? It's not because it's exceptional, it's because it resonates with people who manage to see it because they're pirating it. So it needs to exist. Now, how can it exist if someone like myself can't make them anymore? And it's not through copyrighted that it's going to exist, and it's not through distribution models that think primarily of how am I going to recoup my investment. So think out of the box. All of us here, how are we going to think out of the box? That's my 2 cents worth.
All right. The whole framing, I think we're already way outside the box already. And I think I totally agree with you about the question. There's a huge dichotomy between the films people want to see and will actually make an effort to see, and the films people should see. A brilliant body of work that that just probably won't get made anymore. And that's what we're here to talk about. I think technology can help solve that problem. Just a couple of very quick comments before we jump into the technology. I always felt Iranian films carved a place out for themselves because they're inherently good films. They're just good to watch. I'm not an expert on films, but I think I've enjoyed probably every single one I've seen, and they always seem to be of a quality and a sensibility that was higher. And the films, to an extent, spoke for themselves and charmed audiences everywhere. Perhaps in ways they weren't expecting.
Financed by their own country. Very important.
Financed by their own country. You see, we can go back into that culture thing. We talked about how culture wars are where the society is fighting today, and defining what is culture. It'll be hugely problematic, at least here in the States, and probably in other parts of the world too. Like in a place like Nigeria, people can't agree on anything. There's lots of ethnic, religious differences that people exacerbate for political means. They've actually even stopped teaching history. So in that framework, it'll be hard to come up with a natural, which they do have like a Ministry of Culture, but they're doing things like traditional dances, and I bet you they'd have large arguments agreeing on what kind of films ought to be funded. So we have to do it ourselves. We have to build it ourselves. We have to reimagine these spaces, and I think technology can help do that.
Can
So,
I throw one thing in? Oh,
please
go on. No, go on, Tunde.
go ahead, Laura. If you're going to throw something,
No, I
I'm
just wanted to
perfectly
say,
fine.
I think it's interesting when you say that, and also that the spaces are shrinking. But when we think of the digital space, then how important is it to think of the physical space as well as like a space where actually we find bodies and minds coming together, where we create like a friction zone in order also to make people aware of these films and create this kind of culture around these films. Because if you say we can't agree on any culture because it's so diverse, is that actually the problem, or is it just finding sort of the space to live that culture, or to, you know, when we think about moving everything to the digital, it becomes very isolated and very individualistic. And my question is, to what extent do we need to have the physical space as well to create this kind of culture?
I think preserving
Can
physical
I just
spaces, the
add to
experience of
that as a space of inclusion and exclusion? Because even the USB stick, you need to have a computer to use that USB stick. So included in culture and who's excluded from.
That's not entirely precise, if I may interrupt. You can plug it to a sound system or a TV, so you don't need any computer nor connection to access the TV content. That's like a small clarification on this. I would like to continue though with. I find actually very interesting your angle that is very close to the content and the way the content is being influenced by technologies that are constantly shaping not only our imaginaries, but literally the way we perceive our realities. For instance, I see this very similar to cartography, Google Maps, and geolocation that will show different maps for disputed areas depending on the site you are standing on. This happens also very similar to with the distribution of films that will be shown in certain regions, and in others it will not be possible to have access to them. And on another aspect, what I find especially interesting is how we could be dangerously potentially replicating systems of hegemonic formulas of what the content or the realities would look like, or which realities are the ones that fit and the others not so much. And this might happen very unconsciously as well, because of the fast space, skip intro, swipe right realities we live in, or the aesthetics, the visuals, and what we know works for a trained eye or for an untrained eye. That's something I find fascinating, on another hand, I can imagine for Korean films and Iranian films that have been nationally funded, there's also a national agenda behind, a very strong national agenda behind. And I don't know. Previously, in talk with Abhishek and Laura, I find it very interesting to envision alternate ways that contemplate the grayscale and not the public and the private, but something in between or out of it. And then maybe technology could help or not to find this other player in a way, or this grayscale. Yes.
I completely agree with you, and I think maybe what I want to reflect on is the problem, for me at least, is the fact, where do we start from? Do we start from each culture wanting to preserve itself, and then the concept of solidarity being the connection of these specific identities, each preserving itself, yet not contradictory to working together, which was what internationalism was about when we talked about solidarity of the weak. And this new concept, which I think is part of what my issue with technology is that you need to find this matrix that works collectively for everyone, and thus you need to harmonize a kind of one vision, huh? Because I don't think it's contradictory to be completely Iranian or completely Korean, completely Senegalese, yet live within that global tissage, I don't know what the word is, fabric of being a multiple. And I think the concept of globalization was where, like, okay, everybody needs to eat cornflakes now. Don't eat your fool in the morning, just eat cornflakes. So you won't get any fool ads anymore because everybody needs to eat cornflakes. And what I'm saying is that at a time where this shift, I'll get there, just I'll finish this. At the time where this shift and this possibility of technology is so multiple, why can we not exist as specific cultures, but also part as other cultures? It's not contradictory. We are being led to believe that we need this single harmony where I don't think we need that.
Jihan,
Tunde.
actually, technology has let us do the exact opposite of that. It has led to atomization of audiences, and you can be a complete niche inside the niche. For example, I love everything to do with fishing, and I can watch fishing things for long periods of time. There are channels for me that, like, maybe there's 5 other people watching, but technology has led to a complete atomization, and you can follow your specific niche. So even though, like, Netflix's model with their nearly 200 subscribers, 185 million subscribers, is to amass this huge audience, but they know they're not serving the same content. Like, they can slice it up a different way, and each one will find a slice of the audience that could be injurious to us because it does have some hegemonic effect. I think of them as a large celestial body that's wandered into our solar system. And of course, the orbits of all the planets in there are definitely affected because of the huge mass, and they're affecting everything. And they're probably going to end up in their state because they're crunching down what gets made, what gets selected. But I just wanted, on another point you mentioned at the onset, you talked about the problem of I guess we call it the favored Negro, where they would, like, the man, would choose one or two filmmakers, and the flavor of the month or the year until no longer, and then the space only allows for many. What that is telling me is that what we have today is in exactly working quite as well, which more impetus to the fact that we need to reimagine a future that works better for. And I do think technology can help us do that, but it comes down to an issue of. Go ahead, Juan.
I find it also interesting if we see this more, or shift the idea of the melting pot of all many cultures coming together and becoming one thing, thinking of the patchwork or the quilt, where all these different squares are here together. And with this idea of relating to the differences that at the end of the day make us the same. It's also interesting how these identities are shifting beyond the local territories and finding bridges to, for instance, being in Colombia relating to Tanzania and Vietnam at the same time, and building communities that maybe haven't met never in the physical space, but in another one. And so that's what I think can be interesting to reflect on, relating to what Laura asked before, or the question she brought before.
You know, just to get back to cinema, the power of cinema is huge in terms of the way we see ourselves, and thus the way we engage with the world. Just to give you a very simple example, when in Egypt, when we first got independence, one of the very first, of course, Egypt was the second country to ever have cinema after the Frères Lumière in 1897. You know, the second ever projection of a film happened in Egypt, in Zambia, in the Cotton Exchange. So it was an economic proposal from the beginning. But at the moment of independence, the first thing they set up was cinema became part of a ministry called the Ministry of National Guidance. And the Ministry of National Guidance was given the role to redefine the Egyptian, what the visual, the image of the Egyptian. And it's really interesting because even an Egyptian like myself, when I think of an Egyptian today, I'll probably think of it in terms of the cinema Egyptian, although I know that the people living in the countryside don't actually look like the Egyptians of the countryside. And the reason I say that is what we're talking about here, and what we want technology to help us with is that space of cinema, that space of the imaginary, the space of how we get to see ourselves. And there's so many factors that come and infiltrate to create mythologies. They're all mythologies. The Egyptian man, what the Egyptian looks like, is a mythology. You know, probably our fascination with Iranian cinema is only what passed through the censors. So that's also a mythology. But since we live in mythologies anyway, I think what's important that alongside that imaginary that Nollywood gave us of what the Nigerian should look like, definitely not like Tunde, You know, the way people dance, the Nigerian music that we know today, make us forget all that heritage and all that other stuff that we still have and that we're gonna lose. You see, it's about bringing with us the treasures we have, and yes, adding on to them. They become part of the heirloom for future generations. Imagine how poor we would be if each generation loses the entirety of its heirloom. And I agree with Tunde saying that, yes, you might have fishing channels, but these fishing channels, if some fishing maniac doesn't decide to finance them, they're gone. So how do we find a way where that heirloom, whatever it may be, has a space that is preserved at a cost that is possible for all of us? It doesn't.
And that is the challenge.
Yeah, it doesn't need to be
face.
money making. It needs to be the concept of this needs to exist, so that comes under this criteria. And I think that's what we don't think of.
Okay, on that money-making thing, actually two things. It comes to a business model. I totally agree with you that money-making is not, we're not looking to maximize profit or drive out competitors. The objectives are way different. So the success criteria are defined very, very differently. I think the best one will have social impact objectives. It's not going to be measured in dollars necessarily. There has to be some kind of cost recovery because it's expensive to build the technology, it's expensive to run it, but there are ways and means. Again, once you take profit out of it, it becomes somewhat sustainable, and that's exactly what you want. That a platform that can pay its way at some minimal level and exist. It's got to be completely open. There can't be any paywalls. It's got to be. There could be some thought around how you might fund it, like voluntary funding models. I've seen where those have worked, where pay what you can afford, or you might have a tiered payments depending on where you're coming from, and it could be free for other kinds of people, and it's got to be really deeply social. Laura asked about physical spaces, like can we preserve physical spaces? And even here, I think tech play a role. The new technologies that allow multiple people to watch movies at the same time and interact, and some of them work quite well. I've been fooling around with some of that, and it's not quite the same as going to a movie theater, but it's a pretty social experience. Jihan, you and I watched Versus the other day. You were in, I forget where you were, somewhere in the world, and we were both watching it and commenting, and I enjoyed it very much. It was like we were both drinking in our respective locations, and it was a lot of fun. You remember that? Jill Scott and
Erica Badu.
Fascinating.
Erica Badu.
Badu concert.
Yeah.
And Erica Badu, exactly. So just can be built into an imagined new system that some of the social in, and you can still have as part of the physical spaces where films are being watched.
Okay, just since we're talking about physical spaces, as we all know, cinemas, a country like Mozambique had at least 2 or 3 cinemas in every single city from shore to shore, okay? And they all disappeared, like got to the point where you had like 1 or 2 cinemas left. And we remember that the early 2000s, or maybe late 90s, there was this sudden freak out. Cinemas are disappearing, and then countries started pouring all these, this money and different organizations in saving the cinemas, okay? Now, what I'm trying to say right here is that we're going back to that same thing. Why did you let them die to then spill all this money in trying to make them survive? Okay? The point is, we do not think of simultaneity as an option. We're constantly in the either or. All I'm trying to introduce to the equation is the and. Okay? So when technology comes into the cinema, it can occupy a space inside the cinema and thus make the cinema as a space survive. But what is actually happening is that technology imposes on me a DCP rather than the little tape that costs me like 12 times less. You know, so the DCP becomes a deterrent for me. And then you can only show your film in places that have the DCP. Because if I'm going to fund making a DCP, hell, you know, you're going to show it in DCP. And there's another element that I'll push even further, actually two, if sorry to take up so much space. Number one is the right to the bad image. Technology keeps going linearly over and over. Suddenly 4K becomes the aesthetic visual. I have a right to my bad footage that has a story and has a reality and that is contextualized, because that's the only existing way that it could, like, guys, remember VHS? VHS in the 70s, there's a whole visual reality of the 70s because that's what it was. Now, VHS does not pass the standard of broadcast anymore. So your entire narrative excludes bad footage because of the technology and the dictatorship of the good image. I want to fight for the bad image too, because it has a part in the narrative I come from. Okay, that's number one. Number two is the archive. Now suddenly everyone and his grandmother have discovered archive. Okay, and what they're doing, they're digitizing in good quality that archive. And the mere fact of doing that is transforming what that archive was about and the context of that archive. Yet saving the archive is obviously really important. So you don't say anything about it, but we don't think 3 steps ahead. You know?
Can I push back gently on one little point, Jihan? Referring to physical spaces, you gave the example of I forget, Mozambique, I think it was, that was losing their physical film houses. Now, I still love going to a movie theater. I haven't gone to one in quite a while. I've still been watching movies. But does the marketplace have a role if people aren't going or people are expressing a preference for other forms of entertainment? Do we have a duty to preserve models that have been rejected by the marketplace? I'm probably not putting that inelegantly, but maybe you get what I'm asking. Yes, Abhishek.
I would like to further, maybe push you back gently on that note, and say that I think there is also politics of screen in this atomization. You know, that you're served, as you were saying, that you're served these specific videos that or preferred material algorithmically to you. It is delivered to you, and it contributes to this sort of idea of individualization, where you're separated from the community at large and the possibility of mingling with community, and that's where culture is formed. And I don't know if it's by design by the man, the Illuminati or whatever, but the point is that we find ourselves in the system where we are in this sort of intelligence silo, like that we know so much about something very much, and the narrative is so perfect because we got the history, the present to the future right, but we cannot relate to the person sitting right next to us in a bus, So here I also wonder about this, the technology being delivered to you into your eyeballs, sitting in front of a screen, whereas you don't know how do you speak to a person sitting next to you.
That's a great point, and
Get
let me
on
push
to
back gently at you pushing back gently at me, pushing back gently at Jihan. Actually, I do 100% agree with you that I envision some kind of algorithm. I think there's some kind of usefulness to AI, machine learning, algorithmic sort of determination of what to watch next. It's a big question, especially if you have a huge library of content. However, what I've discovered over the last 3 months was that the Netflix algorithm, for me personally, is useless. I don't like it. It doesn't really recommend things that I really like, or it makes a lot of mistakes for me. But what I found works best are personal recommendations. Like if I got a list that says, boom, from Jihan El-Tahri, the 5 films you should watch this next month. Um, I think that would have value, and just scale that out, play that out with different people. And The Guardian has been doing an excellent job of that. Why you should watch this. And I have my own list of great things that I think, and people should say why you should watch it. I think those kinds of models can work on this kind of new technology platform that we're imagining. So it's not just algorithmic, but it's got a strong human component as well.
Peer
okay,
curation, so to say.
Peer
curation,
curation.
but surprises. I mean, okay, as you said earlier, I'm a member of the Academy, so I get to, by obligation, watch a ton of films, and you do not understand how much discipline it takes to actually watch a film from beginning to end. Okay, this cursor there thinking, okay, I'll just skip 10 minutes because I really can't take this anymore. Huh? Badge myself not to, which is something that you can't do in a cinema. Huh? That is something that allows you an experience that is completely different from the digital experience.
But you can leave,
Of a film.
Jihan. You can leave
Yeah,
the
but
cinema.
most
People
of the time you're too,
walk out.
yeah, but most of the time you're too embarrassed to get up and leave. Okay, just okay. I'll get back to this. Never ever the future generations not take my kids on a date to cinema. How sad is that? But but just in terms of the your control over the technology of how you watch. It could be good. I'm not saying bad. I'm complicating the narrative. What is that? A rhythm of the pace of a film, the language, the construction, the music, the wind. These are languages. These are cinematic languages that you're sitting there in bed, watching on a tiny screen. There is so much you lose. I'm not saying that it doesn't have its moments. I'm not saying that it should be exceeded. All I'm saying is that we need to start not talking in either. There are spaces and there are moments where we have to fight for that big screen, where we have to fight to do this collectively. You have to have that discussion with the guy sitting next to you on the bus, who you are actually going to give him a history he ain't going to find somewhere else. Where you have this discussion where you suddenly know the film may be a completely other vision of why that film was made. And on the other hand, you also have spaces where you could just sit and watch a film because it's late and you're an insomniac. But it's the constant desire for completely moving from one side of the thing to the other that I find that is my battle, I guess, what I'm saying.
I'm just going to throw one little thing, Jihan. That's why we need 4K, so it'll look good on my 60-inch large screen TV. So you can get closer to that theater experience at home.
I'm not on that.
Yeah. I'm also kind of in that position too, or a similar position. Like I see many things in technologies, both the opportunities, but especially the implications, and definitely with engagement algorithms showing us only affirmative content and sleek interfaces. We're going very quickly to a contactless, touchless society. And this frightened me for many years already. Luckily, in a way, the post-COVID-19 realities make us more aware of this new normality we have been already for a while already. And I see a lot the point on like distinguishing these different spaces and adding friction and haptics to our lifestyles and the way we perceive and read this we take in this case from films. So I guess I will join this battle with you to keep the proper spaces for this. Nevertheless, I won't reject the other content that might emerge from these remix possibilities that you have, which is something that I find very fascinating, as I showed before.
You know,
Actually,
music
just
is an
taking that
amazing
point,
precursor. Music is an amazing precursor to everything that happens in the visual world. Huh? And I remember the first time I lived in South Africa, the first time a 19-year-old guy in the township who didn't even have a computer, who managed to get remix to one of the top DJs in America because of technology. Okay, so it opens a magical place. But then what happened is that he was only called for remixing. He was never called to be the creator or the initiator. And that's where this findings of it's not because we joined the technology and became raw material for the more developed to engage in diversity and have a almost a a justification, like, oh no, of course we have African content, remember we did this. No, there's a balance that we need to find. And when we talk about finding these spaces, the South-South, it's also amongst ourselves. Because right now, Nigeria is taking over the concept of Africa, whereas Mali is taking over the concept of African music. You know, and Egypt for a long time, but the internal diversity amongst ourselves is as important as North-South. And how do we make these spaces connect and become accessible and in different formats, depending on what they are and how they are, is what I'm trying to say music is a precursor of.
Along the question of format, we all agree, or at least I certainly agree, that seeing a movie in a great theater, comfortable seats, giant image, fantastic sound is an incomparable experience. It's a singular experience. But Jihan, if someone offered you the opportunity to make a different kind of film, and I guess calling it film is actually loosely calling it film, but it's much shorter and it's designed to be distributed on USB sticks. Or actually, you could probably distribute a full-length movie on USB sticks. Say it's designed to be distributed on 3G
WhatsApp.
networks, and it can only be on WhatsApp. Yeah, it can only be 10 minutes long, and each one is it's like 3 minutes long, but you can have 5 episodes to tell one short story. To be distributed only on 2G or 3G, very choppy video. Would you consider that?
You know, this is a very important question, not because I'm going to answer it, because I'm not. It's an interesting question, because what you've just said is where the whole problem lies. You're thinking format before filming. What is it we are doing with this format? I believe entirely that we resort to image, we resort to sound, we resort to writing, because what we need to say, or what it is we have to say, can find its elaboration in that form. So, I mean, I think Abhishek and Laura, and even you probably know that I make art videos that don't have a single word. All my art videos are silent. But my documentaries, you like, if you miss a word, you're gone. It's like blah, 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 blah. It's constant. Because what it is I chose to do in that format has its own logic. Whereas if you come and tell format is going to impose on you what you do, I don't want to make film. I'll go do something else.
Jihan, you misheard my
I would
question.
No, I've understood exactly your question.
The same person can love a thick, juicy steak. They can also have a hot dog like the next week. You don't have to, you can make both things. You can make.
I can do GIFs. I can do GIFs, which is just 4 or 5 images.
Even smaller.
But that isn't the issue. For me, is what is it we are doing? What is it we are doing? So I think we've gotten into the complexifying the difference between form and content. Kappa, if I'm not...
No, we're saying diversity,
no.
Jihan, is what we're saying. We're saying diversity, that different kinds of content can exist in the space.
Of course they can. But what I'm trying to say, some photographer who, a Magnum photographer, who basically said that, you know, they were talking to him about his technique and how absolutely. He said, you know, if I didn't have something to photograph, we wouldn't even be having this discussion. It's because there was something there that I photographed that I needed to find the best way to make it more pertinent, more powerful. And I guess what I'm trying to say is, of course, there are different formats, and I use them all the whole time. I'd love to sound like I don't want to use technology, but I do use it, obviously. And I do have different formats. I mean, half of the people forget 10 films that were observational and things like that, completely different films that people know of. And people who know these films don't even know that I have every space, and whoever engages with what I'm saying, they have a reason to know that. And I don't particularly think that the people need to know all my body of, it depends on what it is they came to find and got there. So I think our desire to separate form and content is one of the issues that are modernity. Okay, because then we say experimental, but everything's experimental. Now you have experimental slots, but then it needs to be a certain kind of experiment. All this dictation of what it is and how we define, I think, comes with our desire for form to supersede content. I don't want content to supersede form either. I think form and content go hand to hand. And if we forget that, then we go into areas that completely shift narratives. Voila. So I didn't answer your question today.
I noticed.
But I think we also find ourselves, I mean, sorry, I just wanted to comment, have a short comment that we're also finding ourselves in a time where there are technically, let's say, there are so many forms available to us, and also so much content. So there is certainly a disbalance, maybe a disbalance by the people who are maybe guarding the gates, or determining how the system should function, which way what should flow. So maybe, this is something that we need to, hammer and crack open. I'm sure there was, and maybe realizing this, that there is enough form and platforms and content to circulate and to exchange. And now it's about, I guess, connecting the dots, if I'm not mistaken. Just wanted to put that point out there.
Yeah, I think you have a very, very interesting point. But you said a key word that is, I think, one of the reasons we're in this mess. The concept of a gatekeeper. We established the concept of gatekeepers, those who decide what is visible and what is not visible, and what is interesting and what is not interesting. It started with broadcast, when they had these little boxes, they gave you audience. But then the question was, where did you put these boxes? Criteria measuring, and nobody knew. But then in French, it's called audimat. And then suddenly the audimat didn't work. Entire kind of film disappeared off screens. At some point, you had MTV that had a new kind of visual when the image was never straight. Everything on MTV was crooked. And because it was music, and suddenly everything you watched was like crooked. And they thought that was the visual because the audimat of MTV went up. Nobody ever thought, well, maybe it was just the music that was good, And I think that these gatekeepers and these decision makers and these curators, you need them, but they can't become a religion. And what's happening today is that they're becoming religion. And let's be honest, people like myself, people like us, become part of the problem, because, you know, we circulate in a closed vessel where instead of, okay, just to go back to film, okay? A film that starts its life cycle in Berlin, which happens in February, is going to be in every single film festival for the rest of the year, okay? And so this film will have 15 awards in every single film. Now, a film that comes out in April and misses Berlin and is late for Cannes will never circulate. This film can be 10 times more brilliant than everything. But what happens is that the programmers go from festival, watch that that started in February. Very, very few and exceptional films will make it into that system. It doesn't mean that there are hundreds of very worthy films that are made during this time, or one curator didn't select it, like the curator who selected that one film from Sudan, thinking, oh, yeah, there hasn't ever been a film from. Suddenly there's this Sudan's on the map, and you have 3 films being financed at the same time, after years and years and years and years of never having a film for Sudan. I guess what I'm saying is that the concept of gatekeeper that you brought up, Abhishek, is again part of the problem. The way curators and programmers conduct their research. I mean, even people like myself, I try to remember, how did I used to research when I didn't have internet? I used to go to libraries. I used to, which we rarely do today, rarely. And I think it's losing all of this, being able to keep these things side by side and talking to people, picking up your phone and calling people in India, saying what is coming out on the independent scene on your side. And then you make it your business, Abhishek, to take these to the programmer and say, it might have not circulated, but you need to see these films. It's part of what Tunde was saying about, you know, the lists. But again, it can't be constrained to that. Sorry, I'm talking too much.
So it sounds like we have a number of pre-existing conditions, as it were, in the system and as it exists today. And if I'm hearing you correctly, you're very keen that we not replicate exactly those conditions in this new imagined world. However, I'm a little lost as to there's got to be a curation function. We need to have curators, like you said. I mean, even more than before, they're producing thousands upon thousands of pieces of content each year. Maybe not the right ones, but I don't know how that gets better. How do we democratize that in a sense? Is it possible that there could be models that we could consider? Go ahead.
But I think the word democratize is problematic, because it's not about democratizing. It's about.
So it can't be a dictatorship, and so somewhere in between.
No, because I think the problem with democratizing is about pleasing everyone.
So you'll have flat films.
About,
yes.
It's about It's the same thing as quotas. It's the same thing as being chosen to be in something just because woman. I'm sorry, I'm offended. Chosen. Oh, we need a Middle Easterner woman. Oh, there you go. Tick that box. Part of the problem of African cinema is because right now what happens is that everybody wants to talk about young black filmmakers. And so you tick that box. There's money for young black. And so you don't have any funding for anyone who's not young and black. So nobody has a body of work anymore. You have a series of 1-2 films, 1-2 films, 1-2 films. And so there's no even visual narrative, no body of work. You rarely have today who has 8 or 9 films because you can't find financing. You go to try and get financing, you're not black, then you can't get money from the World Cinema Fund, you can't get money from Jeune Talent Francophone, from Doha Fund because it's first or second film. You got everything is a first and second film. So what you establish is the lack of a visual continuum and an evolution of any form of narrative. So I don't want to just boil it down to the funding, but funding is definitely one of the biggest problems, because what funding also does is that it only has place for one curator. You know, you have certain festivals that decide, okay, we're going to have someone for Latin America, we're going to have someone for Africa, and all of you pour in your ideas, and let's have an independent jury to choose amongst them. But you can also have saying, this is an important film. It's got to be seen. It could be good, it could be bad, but it's an important film to be seen. And I remember, sorry, I'll just say this one. I remember in the late 90s, I think it was 1999, there was the very first Angolan film to ever be made after years of war and the rest of it. Might have been 2001, around there. And just didn't select it. And being part of the guild is like, what do you mean? This is the very first Angolan film to ever be made since independence, because there was civil war and the rest of it. It could be whatever you want. You can put it in a special section. You could be put in a, but we need to see this film.
Was that
And
Blue Eyes
what
of
we
Yonta,
ended
by
up,
any chance?
no, it was before it. It was, can't remember the name. And what we ended up doing as the guild is that we took a room. It was L'Indépendance. We took a room, and I took my bed sheet and put it as a screen, and we borrowed somebody's picture, and we showed that film. We had to show it every single night because there weren't people wanted to come see it, but the room was too small, so we could only fit people in, a certain number at a time. So it doesn't matter whether it was good or bad. There are certain things that need to exist. This is just an example. So curators, what are they? Most of the time their criteria is a funding criteria. I used to teach at this lab where you have to have people from Bavaria because Bavaria gives that much money. So it doesn't matter if it's good or bad, but it to be in there. So how do we shift these criteria? How do we as people engaging in this saying, you're going to give your money anyway, but we do not have to follow criteria?
Does the ambition of this intervention include exploring funding options for movies? Abhishek, Laura?
No,
Trust
I
me, if we
mean,
knew about our model, we'd be doing them already.
I mean, I think in
I do
terms,
have a comment though. Yeah, please go ahead, Laura. Sorry.
no, go ahead, Abby.
No, please do. I insist.
No, I just wanted to say that I think we've tackled like a number of important issues, and I think the more we come into this discussion, the more questions arise, of course, and the one of funding is a fundamental one that I think sort of ties down or ties everything together from the film production to this, from the beginning to the end. But I think what we've come to tackle was sort of the question of the curators and the question of a decentralized system, which maybe not democratized, but maybe something where we can try to find a decentralized version that just kind of puts more shoulders into the so more shoulders to carry the burden together, and maybe this can be, or this was something that we had also as a premise of this project and of this platform that we would like to create, is to have something that is outside of the centralized system, or something where we can try to link different spaces and communities to forge for this decentralization. That's just my comment. Abi, now you can go. Or Jihan.
Abby, just before you, when COVID started, okay, the German government deemed bookshops as essential need. And I thought that that was a really important moment, because what happened there is that it not only gave it the economic power, it gave it the space, and it gave it the visibility, and it gave the access. And what we're talking about, all these connecting, how do we find a way to talk about our visual and our cultural existence as an essential basic need? Sorry, parenthesis.
Actually, on that very narrow point, Jihan, Germans read more books than any other nation on earth. Over here in the States, we made liquor stores and weed shops essential to keep open in the lockdown, and that was sensible too, I thought.
I would just say maybe.
I think we have to kind of come to a conclusion, or we won't come to a conclusion. I think we will take all of these elements into the next conversations and into the next 2 years. But yeah, Abby, you may want to say something more.
Well, I just wanted to, underline that we've touched upon various very crucial elements and of what we are, going to look forward to in exploring further and in depth and with you in the coming 2 years and also more. But this is, I think, it's. What today's talk, what I can take back from today's talk is that that there is the content, and there are people who want to watch it, but there are so many restrictions, and there are so many there are so many knots in this whole ecosystem, and there are some. I think the knots are coming from kind of like that when one part of the ecosystem acquires too much power or too much is consuming too much energy. So we need to spread the energy around, spread the vibe around, open the knots, and let it flow. I think this is what we're going to work towards.
All right.
And thank you very much.
Not forget
Thank you very
video
much about it.
clubs.
Sorry, say it again.
Video clubs were a good model.
Yes, totally. I mean, I could say that from India, like there's a film societies that started in the 60s, and they survive even till today. They have 200 film societies or film clubs or video clubs that are still active, and that have the capability to also show film material. Um, but I mean, sadly, they got too close to the government, and now they cannot be critical of the government or even critical of the social system. So but conceptually, they were beautiful because they were preceded by, at least in Kerala, the state that I'm in right now, there came the library movement where every small village had its own little library where a couple of newspapers and books and so on and so forth would be there, and which was followed shortly in within a decade by the film video club movement, which exploded the whole cultural scene. And there is definitely something to learn there and to modernize.
Thanks for adding that last word.
Thank you
I was scared we're gonna go to VHS video clubs, at least
no,
DVDs.
no.
I would love that. I just want the
Take the
people to modernize. I meant the people who are controlling the film clubs, because I've had troubles with them more than with the cassettes.
But actually, it's very important to keep in mind that things aren't stopped. The trend is continuing, and we already know things like, say, in like Africa, for example, we have some of the slowest internet and the most expensive in the world. But there are trends. So what we have today, 5 years, 10 years, it's going to be much better. There'll be more, faster, and cheaper. So some of the things we can't do today, we can do. Um, we can do soon. And it's important to start thinking of the kinds of platforms that can support future technological capabilities. In other words, the platform has to be future proofed. And it's been a great conversation because it's caused me to think about a whole bunch of things that uh, perhaps I hadn't thought about enough. Things that I'm aware of, that there's a huge gap between what people want to see, what's popular. And there are lots of issues around what becomes popular, how do things get popular. There's a lot of literature around that, and that's interesting. But there is a fact that there is what people like, and uh, and niches are great and good, and that seems like that future of there's a whole canon of works. Jihan, you and I were talking about this, that people, like, I worry if people will ever see that, or some of those things. You were talking about Mambeti. Remember when that thing, the first time many people saw that image from that movie was
From
last year with the Beyonce, yeah, and so on. And
the
could people
cow
actually
horns of the
connect the dots? The cow horns on the motorbike, and so on. It's a really iconic. But people, a lot of people, I was reading through some thread. A lot of people didn't know, but they thought, "Oh wow, how original!" And you're thinking, "No, that's not original. That's from 20 years
That's
ago."
40 years old. Yeah.
Exactly.
Anyway,
Great.
my
Thank you,
computer
guys.
is gonna die very soon. Yeah.
Thank you so much for
All
your
right.
time. Just a quick comment. We will have the next Rushes series beginning of September, hosted by Khaled Behna, so we're very much looking forward to that. And to everybody who's watching, and we're happy for your comments. And yeah, via email or Facebook or whatever to take into the next Rushes. That's from my
Also, we
side.
would
Thank you so
like to
much.
thank. Also, we would like to thank our very insightful guests again, Jihan, Tunde, and Juan. Thank you very much for your time. And we thank also Arab Funds for Art and Culture to have supported this. Thank you.
Thanks a lot.
Thank you.
Right.
Thank
Take care.
you.
Take care,
Bye.
guys.
Take care.